I have all along felt like a little bit of an alien element, let's say, in the legal academy. The academy, universities and so forth, are thoroughly secular, at least in their assumptions. And I've believed all along that there's a real loss that comes with that. When I started out teaching, there was a movement called critical legal studies that was kind of a disruptive, deconstructionist, and usually left-leaning kind of movement. But from my perspective, the deconstruction comes from more of a position of faith or religion, saying because you cannot acknowledge some of the religious foundations or the metaphysical foundations of this or that, it's not going to work. A sort of a standard view through much of modern thought is the secularization hypothesis, that the world used to be religious, it's going to become steadily more secular. But increasingly, it just becomes obvious that what you see, for example, in the world in this country, for instance, isn't so much the religious against the secular, it's different forms of religion clashing, so even politically, you have more like people with one kind of religious faith, but on the other hand, you don't really have just sort of secularists, you have people who have a different kind of religion, they're passionate about it. It still sees the world in good versus evil terms. It still inspires the same kind of zealous commitment and so forth that religion has done. In the book, I suggest that it's better to understand religion in terms of a commitment to some kind of sacred, but the sacred can be located within the world. And that, frankly, is what, religion up until the point of Christianity and Judaism essentially did. Pagan religion, gods were gods of this world. The novelty of Judaism, and then especially Christianity as it came on the scene, was to introduce this idea of a transcendent God. My suggestion is it traces back to some ultimately quite critical difference between thinking there is a God who created the world and in a sense provides a certain kind of standard for judging what happens in the world, as opposed to a sort of a sanctity that inheres in human beings and nature and that sort of thing. Still have sacred value, but not that kind of transcendent value. That's the kind of distinction I'm trying to make there. On that particular point, however, I guess I think that Eliot was more perceptive, and I'm not sure that they totally disagreed, because it's hard to know exactly what C.S. Lewis meant when he said there's not going to be any kind of return to paganism. I think a lot of other people seem to be coming to a similar conclusion. Christianity displaced paganism in the ancient world, but did not completely suppress it by any means. And what we see now is a retreat of Christianity and a return of paganism. Not secularism in the old-fashioned positivistic sense. It's some form of religion, but it's immanent religion. And again, I think that's actually quite a useful, not a contrived definition of what paganism amounts to. And I do think we're seeing more and more of that. So that what happens with many people is that they sign on to Darwinism, but are not really, satisfied to leave it with just this positivistic dimension. And so they begin to sort of project some kind of religious or sacred quality onto it. It seems like that is pretty common. To me, what that would sort of show is how difficult it is to make this move to the positivistic secularism, because people do seem to be religious beings in some sense, or have a sense that there is something sacred. So even when a philosophy or a theory comes along that would allow them to discard that, and it's even celebrated in part because it allows that, that doesn't seem to be the way it actually goes. I guess Carl Sagan and Einstein were not in the biology field particularly, but they even get cited, I think, by Ronald Dworkin, Einstein for sure, in his book, Religion Without God, as examples of people who are very religious, but don't believe in a God in the sort of traditional or orthodox, like Christian or Jewish sense. They're immanently religious. So, so a science definitely can go in that direction.
Let's take another crack at it. What is respect for something that, taken to its extreme, could never become religion?
Let me see if I can try to identify two sides of this. The term like religion and immanent religion and paganism, those terms are admittedly broad and elastic enough that they're not useful for some purposes, I think. For example, if somebody says, can you explain or predict particular developments in law or politics that are going to come out of this pagan turn and so forth? No, I can't really do that. It could take any number of forms. These terms are not useful if you're trying to figure out what exactly is going to happen or why this happened rather than that. On the other hand, I don't think it's empty of content by any means, because there is an important distinction between the immanent secular and the sort of more positivistic secularism. Those are quite different things. This is not just sort of a theoretical distinction, but one that is enlightening with respect to a great deal of what we see in the world today, which once again gets back to this idea, the people who are opposed to, let's say, traditional religion are not just sort of detached people who care about certain other values and so forth. There is very often a religious zeal, a kind of a good versus evil, a tendency to demonize those sort of, and I just think that it helps to capture that fact to appreciate this immanent sacred thing. I think that's just a better description of what's happening than secular in the positivistic sense.
Most people who just go about their business and live in society now, who don't weigh through all of this, do feel that they're paying the price. We are deeply without an agreed upon sense of authority, perhaps more than ever.
We can have practical authority on the basis of fictions if they're widely enough believed, but if they come to be seen either, that they are not widely accepted, they can collapse.
I wanted you to talk for a second about the role of jurisdiction, specifically in arbitrating religion-state relations over the centuries.
One way of putting this is that kind of what happened, I think, in modern constitutional jurisprudence is that the religious jurisdiction was relegated to the private domain and was not supposed to have any role really in public affairs. And that is a change, I think, from even our own founding period, because Madison and Jefferson gave very explicitly religious arguments as justifications for the commitment to religious freedom. But today, those would essentially be ruled out of bounds. I think we're suffering from that right now because there's a very live argument in the scholarly community, and it sort of spreads out a little bit to the more general politics about whether there is any very good justification for a commitment to religious freedom. And once you've excluded the religious justifications that Madison and Jefferson and others gave, it becomes very problematic whether you really can come up with an admissible justification for a constitutional commitment to religious freedom. I think that's been a major change in our whole constitutional and political domain, effectively beginning, say, around the 1960s. I argue that the school prayer decisions were especially important. It's been a major transformation, I think, and in many ways, one I think that's had some pretty disastrous consequences.
You write in Fictions, Lies, and the Authority of Law, modern theorizing about religious freedom is infected by an inner decay. The assumptions and rationales that gave rise to our distinctive constitutional commitments have been forgotten or rejected or ruled inadmissible. And so we carry on an inherited discourse that now consists of empty conventions, no longer filled with real life. Well, that is... I
didn't remember that, but I got to say that was well put.
that was a bittersweet eulogy. So my question is religious freedom the only constitutional value subject to that unfortunate description? What about federalism or private property or freedom of conscience? Are these values also in danger of becoming empty conventions, no longer filled with life?
This is a transformation that is surely not limited in its implications to religious freedom. It has much broader implications, I think. I think it's fair to say that many or most of our most central, let's say, constitutional political commitments are grounded in Judeo-Christian rationales. So commitments to things like equality, the dignity of the person, and many of them are grounded in something like that. Now, what will happen if those rationales are excluded is hard to say. My concern is once you kind of cut the foundation out from under something, it may persist for a while, but it doesn't seem very secure to me. But it definitely is not limited to religious freedom, freedom of speech, even just human equality. I think if you look at the world today, in one way or another, all those things are under siege in a sense. So I guess I do think we live in perilous times because basically of this kind of transformation we're talking about. Not only some of my friends like Andy and I, but my wife and I have sort of disagreements about what attitude to take about this. Should you say, look, this is the way things are going, this is the arc of history, and it's kind of like this old way of life is doomed? Or should you say, no, we've got to be hopeful and, fight the good fight and, and try to, restore whatever foundations we can and so forth. I don't know what the answer to that is. So I tend to say we try to do both at the same time. Try to do both at the same time. But, on my part, without any great hopefulness that the restoration project is going to succeed. So
I just want to go back to your Harvard Law Review piece on Kent Greenawalt's book. You write in your review, in sum, Greenawalt's book exhibits a puzzling split-level character. On one level, in discussing discrete controversies, his approach seems lavishly rational. He presents and ponders the various arguments, pro and con, in leisurely and methodical fashion. There's no argument or sub-issue so minute as to be unworthy of scrutiny. But with respect to ground-level questions of justification, why is religion being given special interest? What justifications can be given for the precepts that inform Greenawalt's specific conclusions? How does the Constitution operate to impose binding requirements and constraints on us? Greenawalt seems almost aggressively complacent in these. He acknowledges difficulties in the various rationales that he himself invokes and relies upon, yet he exhibits virtually no interest in investigating those complexities. Is it really just a question of, or a matter of sort of begging the question? You seem to be gently accusing him of that.
This is a personal thing, I guess. I think he's, been a prominent academic at Columbia he was going back into the 1960s and so forth. That's the environment in which he's worked. He has been situated in a particular environment that makes it probably very natural to favor the sort of respectable positions on different things, which would, be in line, I suppose, with what the Supreme Court and so forth are saying. Our situations are, we all have different situations. I've been always, I think, more of an outsider in that sense. I haven't been, I've been a visiting professor at Michigan and Virginia, but I've never really taught at, the big Ivy League schools. I've always considered that to be, kind of an advantage in the sense that I felt like I can take an independent outside perspective and not be, too heavily influenced by the prevailing opinions at places like that. But Kent's position always has been different than that. He's always been kind of the prominent, respectable figure. And, I respect that. I think he's a very, good-hearted, generous person, but his conclusions do tend to be sort of mainstream and conventional. Yeah.
So you found yourself in the, I suppose, unfortunate role, it sounds like, of having to play the heavy in writing your review and pointing out those things. This idea of his perhaps favoring harmony over articulated values. But you apparently were on the receiving end of that sort of relationship in a review of your book, Law's Quandary, in 2006. You are one of the few people who has the honor of having a book reviewed by Antonin Scalia.
Oh, you came across that one. Okay. Well, of course, I was delighted to have a book reviewed by Scalia. Although I think Scalia didn't quite understand me in some ways. Some of the things he says in the review make it clear that he thinks I'm sort of your standard liberal constitutional law professor favoring, a lot of stuff like that. And I thought, boy, if he knew me, he'd. So Law's Quandary, I didn't really think of it this way, but some people have read it as kind of like a defense of natural law. So in that sense, I think Scalia was, like I say, onto it. It was sort of perceptive. This is sort of the way it would go. If they thought that's great. So I'm glad you saw that, Justice Scalia.
I come at this from a different angle, and I'm trying to do these videos on behalf of other people like me who do not work in the trenches in the law and spend their lives doing other things. From that perspective, have you in some cases out Greenawalted Greenawalt? Like Scalia says, we just don't say it.
So the Scalia suggestion might be, say the God word, I think he says, and then it all makes sense. My problem, though, one reason why I would not have wanted to write that book is I'm not sure it does make sense. Is the thing, a whole lot of what we do, I think, probably just doesn't make sense.
Giving special treatment to religion. Is that an example of what you mean?
Yes. Yeah, that would be another example. It doesn't make sense on what we're doing. What we're doing doesn't make sense. on assumptions that we're allowed to say and rationales that we're allowed to give today.
Can you just explain why it doesn't make sense?
Well, the basic argument would be we treat religion as a kind of a special, we have various kinds of freedoms that are constitutionally protected, but we have a few that are singled out for special protection, like freedom of speech. That's different than just general liberty. Religion has been one of those. Why single out religion for special protection? Which is a question that's being very seriously debated in the academy today. A number of scholars think there isn't any good justification for singling out religion for special protection, but just say, well, historically, some of the most important reasons were religious reasons. Jefferson, Almighty God hath created the mind free, and Madison, gave similar rationales. But if we can't give those rationales today because they're religious rationales that are supposed to be excluded from the public sphere, then can we come up with good reasons for doing that? And this is, it's definitely an instance of something where I would say what we've been doing doesn't make very much sense on the rationales that we can articulate today for those things. Now, people like, Professor at Virginia, Micah Schwartzman, who sometimes is my nemesis on certain issues these days, might say, yeah, that's absolutely right. And it doesn't make sense. And so it would be better if we didn't give special protection to religion, because there isn't really any good justification for it. This is one area where I might go the other way and say it can make sense. At least the general idea of giving special protection to religion can make sense on a religious rationale. And I think that's an area where I do say that. Now, you can't compel anybody to accept the religious rationale. So, whether that's something the Supreme Court could do or the legal academy could do or would do is, that's very debatable. But I think there you can say, no, this could make sense on a religious rationale.
When Micah Schwartzman says, maybe we should do this or maybe we should do that, you quote your friend Kent Greenewalt as using that same phraseology in describing what we should do about this or that. And you say, well, it depends what we mean by we. If we means the legal academy, indeed, we should do that. For Micah Schwartzman, I doubt he means we, the voters, in a national plebiscite under Article 5.
No, he probably doesn't mean that, although he has one article, for example, the basic thrust of it would be there isn't any good justification for special treatment or special protection for religion. Nonetheless, it is a fact that it's in the First Amendment. So we're kind of stuck with that to some degree. But, it would be better if we didn't have a First Amendment that gives special treatment to religion. I think that would be his view.
Okay, last thing I'll say is, well, you did mention earlier that to the extent religion has lost its jurisdiction, as we said, and that could feed over into other values and rights like private property, as it has the same basis as religion. I've read something called a progressive statement of property authored by a Harvard law professor named Joseph Singer and a few others, where, as far as I can tell, the purpose is to completely uproot our understanding of property throughout the centuries and replant this synthetic idea of property, which is an idea, an empowerment, an economic bundle of rights that really needs to be distributed through the wisdom of government.
I haven't read that, but it wouldn't surprise me at all because, that would be a sort of standard crit kind of position. Singer's kind of on the crit side of things, and that would be a sort of standard crit kind of position. With religious freedom, I think it's easier to trace a fairly direct connection to this and Christian ideas. With property, I think it would be more complicated, to trace a direct connection.
If and when religion goes, start bailing the ship, because when your friend Schwartzman gets his way, then Joseph Singer gets his way shortly thereafter.
It's sometimes observed, and I think accurately, that although conceptually religious freedom can be distinguished from other kinds of rights like property rights and free speech rights and so forth, that regimes that don't respect religious freedom tend not to respect other rights either and so forth, and conversely, those that respect religious freedom tend to be more respectful of other kinds of rights. A great deal of what we value in sort of modern liberal democratic societies, rights and property and so forth. And if that becomes more excluded or less relevant or not believed or whatever, I think it's up for grabs as to what's going to happen with a whole lot of the things that a lot of us value. I think we've touched on that point already, but I think that's true. So.
I argued with some friends in an online forum that a society without religion will become centralized, authoritarian, totalitarian. It just seems impossible for that not to happen. Religion, putting aside one's religious convictions, it's the ultimate check and balance.
Well, there are a couple ways in which that might be true. What you just said, I think, might be true. I think, the founding period, a lot of them believed that you couldn't really have a free society without a virtuous citizenry, and that you couldn't really have a virtuous citizen, bunch of citizens without religion in some way being the basis of it. That was a sort of common view. That view is probably regarded with some scorn today, but it's not at all clear that they weren't right. It goes back again to this sort of dual jurisdiction idea that you brought up earlier in the conversation. It's just not just for the church or religion, but in general, I think it's sort of important if you say there's a jurisdiction above this jurisdiction of the state, and the state doesn't have jurisdiction over everything, and when you get rid of that or privatize the religious sphere and so forth, so people are free to believe that on their own if they want to, but that doesn't have any significance really for most public purposes and so forth. There isn't anything above the state. I think that can limit it. So then limitations have to come sort of from within. You have to say, well, we still want to limit it in different ways, and we can try to do that legally and this kind of thing. But it's much more fragile, I think, in its grounding. And when the pressures come along to get rid of some of those things, there's not much to resist them, I think. And so I think it is true that when you get rid of the separate religious jurisdiction, let's just say the risk of heading in a more totalitarian direction is very real. You might be amused by this, but a little conversation. So when I was in law school, I took a class in constitutional theory from well, just in case, you probably wouldn't mind, but just in case, from let's say a very prominent, someone who's been very prominent as a constitutional scholar and a pretty good guy, and it was a good class and everything. But I had to write a paper. We all had to write a paper, and my paper, I don't remember really what it was, but it was kind of advocating a really federalist response, leaving more to the states, and so forth, not nationalizing and not leaving so much to the courts and the national government. So, he had interviews with all of us, and, he said, yeah, I liked the paper. It was interesting. You probably ought to try to publish it and so forth. He totally disagreed with it, and he says, and at one point he says, I don't understand what you people are afraid of, really. He says, I run into someone like you now and then. What are you afraid of, trying to resist, judicial and national power?
Yeah.
And so I said something like, well, it involves resolving these philosophical questions that people have for centuries, disagreed about. And what's the likelihood that the Supreme Court's going to be able to, resolve them satisfactorily, or, even the legal profession? And he says, well, they're hard questions, but where are they ever going to be resolved if not like at Yale Law School? And he was perfectly, and he was serious about it. I just thought, whoa, but surely we can do it. And there's something about that attitude. It seems like people think, well, yeah, we're fallible. We don't claim perfection or anything like that, but we're still the best there is to resolve all this stuff. And I've always viewed my role, actually, in this respect, from the very beginning, as just kind of a resistor. I'm in this profession, and I'm trying to resist this kind of dominant tendency and so forth. So somebody's got to stand against that.
Yeah.
My father-in-law early on, and my dad probably thought this too, that the world would be a lot better off without lawyers and law professors, and that a lot of what we write is worthless, and even pernicious. And my thought all along was, I agree, a lot of it's worthless and a lot of it's pernicious, but I can still justify my role in here because I'm trying to resist it. I've always sort of viewed it that way. I'm not trying to further the enterprise. I'm trying to resist it to some degree. But yeah, those are the, in some ways, kind of natural tendencies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I've absolutely trashed your Thursday.
It's been enjoyable. Sorry, I probably used a lot more of your time than you were planning to devote to this.
No, it's great. In all honesty, thank you so much for writing the books that you write. There are people out there like me who read them and, are very appreciative.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It's nice to think that might be true, because you're not sure whether it's in your
Well, okay, I'll let you go
Okay.
then.